All right, let's jump right into this deep dive. You've shared some really powerful material that takes a hard look at Somalia, focusing on, well, specific, deeply difficult realities.
Yeah.
It's a way to see the challenges, not just through broad headlines, but through individual, almost agonizing examples.
Exactly. The sources you provided, they zero in on what they describe as 4 distinct tragedies, or maybe moments of profound difficulty.
Hmm.
And our goal here is to really unpack each one, understand the context the source gives us, and see what these specific examples reveal about the larger, systemic challenges facing the country.
Okay. So consider this mission control for
Yeah.
understanding the nuances, maybe. We're taking these poignant snapshots to illuminate the underlying issues in Somalia,
Yeah.
going beyond the easy narrative.
And these aren't isolated incidents, right? They're symptoms of deeper breakdowns.
Absolutely. And speaking of breakdowns,
Mm.
the first example the source highlights is it's gut-wrenching. The death of a 2-year-old child because they had type 1 diabetes and insulin was simply unavailable or
Gotcha.
something the family couldn't afford.
It's a story that immediately tells you how fundamental the problems are. The sources emphasize that, in most places today, type 1 diabetes in a child, while serious, it's manageable with insulin.
Right.
But the material points out that in Somalia, the entire public healthcare system, it kind of collapsed back in the early 1990s during the Civil War. Hospitals, clinics, the whole supply chain, all destroyed or abandoned.
And rebuilding has been incredibly difficult, hasn't it? Underfunded, insecure. That's what the sources say.
Precisely. Which means a life-saving medicine like insulin, something discovered, 100 years ago,
Yeah.
it just doesn't consistently make it to large areas of the country.
No.
And even when international aid brings it in, the sources note it rarely gets to rural areas because there's just no functional national distribution network.
And it's not just about getting it into the country, is it? The material talks about the cost being a massive barrier and also awareness.
That's a huge part of it. Outside the few places where NGOs might operate in major cities, the source says insulin can cost anywhere from a week's to several months' wages for a poor family.
Months.
Yeah. So when you're making impossible choices just to get food and clean water, insulin is, well, it's out of reach. And then there's medical literacy.
Right.
The source highlights that parents might not recognize the classic symptoms in a toddler. The constant thirst, frequent urination, unexplained weight loss.
They might just think the child's tired or has a bug.
Exactly. They might just appear listless, always thirsty, maybe a persistent diaper rash. By the time it progresses to diabetic ketoacidosis, that severe, life-threatening complication, it's often too late.
Wow. And the source makes this really stark comparison, saying this is a marker of the country falling behind. What does that mean exactly?
It does. It contrasts this situation with the mid-1940s, when insulin was becoming accessible even in many low-income nations, allowing children with type 1 to actually live.
Yep.
So for a child to die from lack of it today, it signals a healthcare regression by decades.
Yeah.
It's a horrifying reality.
So this single tragedy isn't just about insulin, but the absence of
Well,
an entire system.
exactly. The sources use this one example to show multiple layers of failure. No neonatal screening, no basic pediatric care or outreach, no emergency transport, no pharmacies that consistently stock the medicine, no trained medical staff who know how to manage these conditions. The whole chain is just broken.
For you listening, this story, as painful as it is, it cuts right to the core. It shows that the crisis here isn't just about guns and conflict. It's about the most fundamental human services. The simple right of a child to have a chance at life, being completely absent because basic societal systems have utterly collapsed.
It reveals the depth of that breakdown in the most human way possible.
And that lack of internal support, it also pushes people outwards, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Which brings us to the second point the source highlights.
Mm-hmm.
The agonizing death of 20 young Somalis who drowned attempting that perilous sea crossing.
This is a direct result of the despair inside the country. I mean, the sources explain that for young Somalis, options are incredibly limited. Many end up stranded in neighboring countries like Kenya or Ethiopia, where opportunities are scarce. And trying to find legal ways to get to Europe or North America is almost non-existent.
So they're forced onto these incredibly dangerous routes then.
Yes. The sources describe journeys that often take them through chaotic places like Libya, where they are vulnerable to smugglers or even kidnapping and ransom demands,
Oh, man.
before attempting crossings from places like Tunisia or Turkey.
And despite all those dangers on land, the sources make clear that for many young Somalis, risking the sea journey is seen as the only viable path to find safety or a livelihood in Europe.
It's a horrific calculus, really. The source material talks about these drowning events, frequently involving completely unseaworthy boats, tiny fishing skiffs, sometimes called kayos, crammed with 30 or more people.
30 plus in a small skiff.
Yeah, it takes very little: an engine failure, a storm, even just a big wave for them to capsize.
And rescue isn't something they can count on, I assume.
No, not really. The sources note that Coast Guards rarely conduct rescues, and these flimsy boats often sink long before anyone could intercept them. And even if migrants are rescued,
Yeah.
the material points out they often face detention, extortion, or deportation. The source makes a really powerful statement here, saying that sitting in a dinghy with maybe a 50% chance of sinking is an act of absolute desperation.
It's basically saying,
It's essentially saying, my current reality is so bleak, I have so little left to lose, I'll risk everything. Death is an acceptable risk compared to staying.
wow. And the source connects this directly to what it terms a broken youth pipeline. What's that about?
That comes from the country's history: 40 years of fragmentation since 1991, ruled by shifting mixes of warlords, clan militias, and outside interests. For young people growing up in this, there's just no clear path forward described in the sources.
No clear path, like education, jobs.
We're talking about a lack of stable schooling beyond maybe primary level, almost no vocational training, and virtually no basic infrastructure needed for a modern economy. Things like a reliable electric grid for computers or, functioning banks for starting small businesses.
And this despair isn't limited to just the most conflict-affected areas, right? The source says it's broader.
That's a crucial point from the sources. Even in regions like Somaliland and Puntland, which have more stability, relatively speaking,
Yeah.
there's still a massive youth exodus because of the sheer lack of opportunity. And even for those who manage to get an education, the source points out that government jobs or positions in ministries are often given out based on clan quotas or connections to the elite, not based on merit or qualifications.
So paying a smuggler for a chance on a boat becomes the last desperate option. Is that the idea?
Exactly. The sources connect it all back. They say that whether someone dies by the gun from conflict or by drowning in a rubber dinghy, it fundamentally stems from this same deep lack of opportunity and despair over the ongoing clan warfare, the presence of groups like Al-Shabaab, and the weakness of the state.
These 20 young lives lost. They aren't just abstract numbers then. As the sources so powerfully illustrate, they are the human cost of a society where an entire generation of youth sees no viable future within their own borders. It's a direct link to the global crisis of migration, driven by despair and statelessness.
It makes the statistic intensely personal, doesn't it?
It really does. Okay, let's shift focus a bit to the third story from the material, which gets into the political maneuvering. This one talks about Somaliland's leader making claims about getting U.S. recognition and involving the port of Berbera and this highly controversial offer to host exiled Gazans.
Right. This brings us to Somaliland, which has indeed functioned as a self-declared independent state since 1991. The sources note that compared to much of the rest of Somalia, it has managed to build relatively functional services, collecting taxes, maintaining some rule of law, holding elections. They have a level of de facto statehood.
But still, no formal international recognition after all this time. Decades.
Right. That recognition from the global community remains the big prize they are constantly seeking. The sources discuss the claims made by Somaliland leaders regarding potential U.S. recognition. There have been sporadic statements, especially referencing the possibility under a Trump administration, whether that was back in 2020 or, looking ahead to 2025.
And this talk about the port of Berbera as leverage, the source calls that hyperbolic. Seems like strong language.
That's the term used, yeah. The sources view it not as a genuine legal offer to hand over the port to the U.S. military, but rather as a highly exaggerated way to try and gain favor with Washington.
So more like a sales pitch.
Kind of. More of a pitch saying, look, if you recognize us, we can offer you a secure strategic naval presence.
Okay, that makes sense. But then there's the the disturbing offer to host Gazan Palestinians. What's the source's take on that?
The sources highlight the deep incongruities here. They describe Gazan Palestinians as people from a Mediterranean culture, Arabic-speaking, with strong urban roots and networks.
Right.
The sources argue that uprooting them and moving them to Hargeisa, where the dominant language is Somali and the culture is rooted in pastoralism and clan structures, well, it would be culturally devastating for the Gazans.
And the sources frame this offer as driven by cynical political calculation.
Yeah. Absolutely. The sources see Somaliland's offer to potentially facilitate the displacement of Palestinians as profoundly disturbing. It's seen as an attempt to exploit the suffering of Gazans as a bargaining chip to gain that international recognition they crave.
Wow.
The sources call it a cruel irony that a region seeking its own right to self-determination would consider playing a role in denying that very right to Palestinians, potentially aiding in their expulsion from their homeland.
So the sources see cynicism on multiple levels here, towards Somalis too.
Yes, they talk about cynicism towards Somalis by using Palestinian suffering as part of a political maneuver that ultimately disrespects both groups, and cynicism towards fundamental human rights because exiling Gazans to a distant region where they lack diaspora networks and economic prospects fundamentally violates their right to self-determination and the ability to rebuild in their homeland.
This particular story, as the sources present it, is a stark illustration of how desperate the quest for recognition can be, leading to really cynical, opportunistic political strategies that potentially harm vulnerable people, both within and outside Somalia.
It definitely shows how political calculation can seem to override humanitarian concerns in these situations.
Let's move to the fourth and final point in the material, which brings us back to Mogadishu and the perpetual cycle of elections. The sources discuss an opposition meeting, preparing for what's called another sham election, involving figures seen as beholden to foreign powers.
Yeah, this speaks to the core of Somalia's governance challenges described in the sources. The electoral system isn't one person, one vote. It's deeply indirect, clan-based, and, well, the sources say it's rife with corruption.
How does it work then exactly?
It's a multi-stage process. Clan elders select delegates, those delegates pick members of parliament, and then the MPs elect the president.
And the sources say this system was originally intended to manage power sharing among clans, but it's become something else entirely.
Yes, it's become, in the words of the source material, an endless process of bargaining and deal-making. Each elder pledges their delegates' votes to a presidential candidate in exchange for concrete benefits, parliamentary seats, positions in ministries, personal commissions from government contracts, appointments, things like that, you know?
Right, and this is where foreign influence really comes into play, creating these divided loyalties the source mentions.
It's a major factor highlighted in the sources. Since the 2017 Gulf crisis, Somali politics has become a proxy battleground, primarily between the UAE and Qatar, sometimes Saudi Arabia too.
How does that play out?
The sources describe ministers meeting openly with Emirati officials seeking financial backing, and Qatar funding specific political figures or media outlets in Mogadishu. It's quite open.
And Ethiopia is also mentioned, with their forces maintaining a presence.
Yes, ostensibly they're there to counter al-Shabaab, but the sources suggest they also protect Ethiopia's own strategic interests, perhaps subtly working against a strong, unified Somali state that could challenge them. They cultivate relationships with local warlords who shift their loyalties depending on whether it's convenient to align with Mogadishu or Addis Ababa.
And the U.S. has its own leverage through counterterrorism aid and drone bases, right?
That's another layer described. Politicians seeking U.S. security aid often line up, as the sources put it, with staff from the U.S. Embassy and may speak publicly in favor of deeper U.S. military involvement, even if it means potentially ceding more Somali sovereignty.
So with all these layers of deals, clan interest, and foreign money, the idea of an election feels almost predetermined. Is that why the source calls it a sham?
That's exactly why the sources call it a sham election that feels inevitable. There's no transparency, no mechanism to track campaign finance. Outsiders with vast amounts of money can simply buy blocks of delegates.
Okay.
The sources note that seeing opposition candidates posing in photos with foreign dignitaries isn't a coincidence. It's a signal of where their funding is likely coming from.
And corruption seems built into the political structure itself, not just a bug but a feature.
The sources argue it's not a flaw, it's integral. Ministers who are already enriching themselves by pocketing revenue from things like customs fees, land deals, or tech points will simply rebrand themselves as the opposition when election season rolls around, claiming to represent the youth or reform.
Wow.
The sources call it a farce because the system is designed to ensure these same patronage networks and power structures just recycle themselves.
And the constant political drama, this theater, It has a real human cost beyond the corruption.
It deeply erodes public trust, according to the sources. For Somalis who can afford it, it's just kabuki theater, something to ignore. But for the millions who can't leave, these cycles of governments that promise stability deliver only insecurity.
Like what kind of insecurity?
Things like public servants not getting paid, they call it ghost wages, continued pillaging of resources, infrastructure like roads and schools falling apart, local fisheries being sold off to foreign interests, basic stuff.
And rather than bringing people together, these elections actually sharpen clan divisions.
The sources highlight that each election cycle intensifies animosities. Politicians actively stoke resentments along clan lines. This clan voted for me, that one voted against. It's divisive and, according to the sources, can sometimes even trigger armed skirmishes.
So this fourth point really shows how political processes meant for sharing power can get so thoroughly corrupted by external influence and internal patronage that they stop serving the people entirely, and instead just perpetuate instability and deepen existing divides.
It's a system that seems designed, unfortunately, to benefit the elite at the expense of the populace.
Yeah. So let's pull all four of these threads together, as the sources do. Why, when you look at the child dying for lack of medicine, the youth drowning at sea, the political grandstanding, and the corrupted election cycles, why is the overall picture so agonizing?
Well, the sources use these 4 points to paint a picture, almost an anatomy, of state failure. The child dying of type 1 diabetes isn't just a medical issue, it's the absence of basic healthcare infrastructure.
Right.
The youth lost at sea aren't just migrants. Their deaths highlight the complete lack of viable jobs, education, and opportunity. Somaliland's actions show how desperately political legitimacy is sought, not as a covenant with citizens, but as a transaction to be bartered.
Okay.
And the cycle of opposition and incumbent reveals democracy functioning not as a shared vision, but as terms in a ledger of deals and patronage.
And the sources conclude that these things together portray a nation whose greatest wealth is its human potential, but that potential is tragically untapped, crushed by these systemic failures.
Exactly. And the human cost of this is immense and compounding. For those lost at sea, the sources mention that grief multiplies because families are often left with uncertainty, mourning without confirmation of death or a body to bury.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
And the sources talk about a pervasive sorrow and resignation. It's not like a single sharp disaster, but a slow burn crisis. A clinic being bombed here, an official kidnapped there, an elder being bribed, leading to a chronic emotional toll. People become numb to it, or they break.
And for the large Somali diaspora, the anguish is incredibly difficult, isn't it? Compounded by guilt.
Yeah, the sources touch on that. They send remittances that are desperately needed but can't fix these deep systemic problems, and they're tormented by the fact that these worst stories just keep happening.
It's a powerful and heartbreaking portrait of the weight carried by Somalis, both inside the country and around the world.
Definitely.
So this deep dive into the source material reveals how these four seemingly separate stories, a child's preventable death, a migrant tragedy, a cynical political play, and a corrupted electoral system, are fundamentally interconnected. They illustrate the systemic failures and the profound human cost in Somalia today.
And what stands out, I think, is how the potential of the people, which the sources identify as the country's real wealth, is just locked away, trapped by these cycles of deprivation, political dysfunction, and external interference.
And that leaves us with a truly challenging question to sit with, doesn't it? One that builds on the difficult reality the sources describe. When the very structures of governance seem so deeply entrenched in external influence and internal patronage, and when everyday life is marked by such basic deprivation and despair, what does it actually take for hope to emerge? And thinking about the untapped human potential, as sources mentioned, what role could that possibly play in forging a truly different path forward? Something to think about.